think of ourselves as the most powerful beings in the universe, it's unsettling to discover that we're wrong. Time has come to see the world as it is.
Can we pull back the veil of static and reach into the source of all being? Behind this curtain lies this random pattern generator. You will be responsible for an escalation that will destroy everything.
In this episode, I'm going to recount a handful of events from my past. Back in the days when I was microdosing and invoking, before I had begun doing parasite extractions, I remember listening to the album 10,000 Days by Tool one night, and the songs Wings for Marie and 10,000 Days hit me so hard emotionally that I fell to the floor. When I looked up, I spiritually saw Maynard James Keenan, who is the singer in Tool, standing over me, giving me a very serious and chastising look. I immediately felt that this was not the spirit of Maynard Keenan, but was instead the spirit of the musical act Tool as a whole, which was manifesting physically as Keenan's form. This was my first time meeting with the spirit of a musical project, something which I've experienced many times since. For example, one time while invoked and listening to the band The Knife, the spirit of the Swedish musical act took control of my body and manipulated me like I was a marionette, making me dance in an extremely alien, bizarre manner that fit the music perfectly. Going back to the Tool entity, he zipped across my room instantly by temporarily becoming a laser-like beam of light. When he quickly reformed, he was standing in front of my bathroom door, pointing at my cat's litter box. I couldn't hear him, but I could see him yelling at me furiously. I could perceive that he was scolding me for allowing the litter box to get to such a filthy state without cleaning it. He was telling me that, as a magical person, I should goddamn know better than to allow such a filthy thing into my home. One night, while microdosed and invoked, I had a very surprising and unsettling confrontation. I spiritually saw a humanoid being walk into my apartment through the sliding glass door that led to my patio. It was average human height, its arms were longer than normal human length, its skin was scaly, it had a very thick and muscular neck, and it had a reptilian face. I have never been a fan of conspiracy theories about reptilians secretly running the world, and I absolutely despise David Icke, but I couldn't deny the reality of the reptilian being which was standing right in front of me. It walked up to a triptych painting I had created, which was 3 different interpretations of the Magician Tarot card, and it pointed at a symbol which I had created years ago and then looked at me with a hostile look of warning. The symbol was a triangle with 3 circles, which were aligned with each of the 3 edges of the triangle. I had created this symbol after an experience I had where, while sober, I closed my eyes and saw that triangle with circle symbol in front of my vision with rays of light shooting out behind it. I couldn't explain this vision, but I did adopt the symbol to represent my work as an artist. This being was trying to tell me that the symbol represented some group which we was a part of, and that they were not happy with me using it as my own. As the reptilian being walked back out of my apartment, I spit at it. As the spit passed through its body, it jerked its head back at me in very surprised shock and fear. It acted like it couldn't believe that I would have the courage to do such a thing. I then yelled at it to get the hell out and never come back. It left looking injured and afraid. When I discussed this encounter with my spirit contacts, they said that he was indeed an unwelcome intruder and that he did mean me harm. He was an envoy or thug of a sort for more powerful beings who sent him there to intimidate me. They said that the triangle with circle symbol represented a confederation, or more like a dictatorship, of nasty alien beings of which negative reptilian thugs are a part. My guide said that the symbol was conveyed to me years ago by the nasty spirit being who had hacked me twice and had smashed my end table. He said that malicious demonic beings like that entity are used as weapons against people by the higher powers of this evil alien group. My spirits told me that, in addition to reptilian thugs, this group of nasties also includes a very negative group of tall gray aliens who unfortunately hold a lot of sway in our world. This happened in the apartment, which I was abruptly and thankfully forced out of, and my spirits told me that that community was subconsciously, spiritually, under the thraldom of this terrible group of alien beings who have unfortunately been infiltrating in human affairs. Fascist and racist groups and communities tend to be under their dominion. My spirits also told me that not all reptilian beings, who are also known as benties, are nasty. Some of them are benevolent entities, but because of the nasty ones, they have an unfortunately bad reputation in the UFO world and amongst mediums and remote viewers. They also say that notions of them completely controlling the human race are blown way out of proportion, so don't listen to extremist alarmists like David Icke. And now, the news.
What the hell in God's name is going down here?
A man in Switzerland claims he had an encounter with an unidentified flying object seconds before it threw him to the ground. The unnamed man said he was on a morning walk with his 2 dogs in Gummenen, Switzerland, when the object appeared. It was transparent. The air starts flickering like on a hot day in a desert, he wrote on a report to the Mutual UFO Network last Sunday. As the air began to get warmer, the Swiss said, a white, gray ball came out of the flying object. It was moving toward me and my dogs. I felt something like an electric field, and I had the feeling of a non-verbal, unknown communication, a beautiful, peaceful heat in my body. But the peaceful heat came to an end when he tried to capture evidence of the oddity with his cell phone camera. That's when something like a flash hit me, he said, adding that he was immediately thrown to the ground. While laying down there, the eyewitness recalls, he reached out for his cell phone and realized something was peculiarly amiss. The time indicated on the display was over 30 minutes, he said, also pointing out that the air was not hot anymore and that the strange object was gone. His dogs, who had also apparently been hit with the unknown flash, reportedly woke up about 50 minutes later. Missing time is commonly reported by people who believe to have been abducted by extraterrestrial beings. A Texas resident says she saw a dragon-like being in the Sabine River of Houston. The woman and her husband were reportedly fishing from a boat when she encountered the creature swimming by her side. My husband and I stayed at a beach house near Sabine, the woman said, a 46-year-old administrator for a rural real estate lender. He wanted to fish brackish water. I remember us being in our little flat-bottom aluminum boat, scooting around the water with a bunch of big ships stocked up. This is where I saw this thing, she added about the alleged 1999 encounter. According to the woman, the sighting lasted only a few seconds, but she was able to spot some of the physical features of the creature. A long, spiky tail the size of a tree trunk diameter had come out of the water. It had a single row of spiny spike things that went along the whole length of the tail. When I saw it, I immediately thought of an image of a dragon tail, like a dinosaur, she explained. I saw two humps of the tail moving in and out of the water as it slowly went under the water. It made very little splash. Imagine how a snake's tail slithers sideways, horizontally on land. What I saw was similar to that, but was vertical. I did not see its head. The real estate lender says she was so worried about being harmed by the unknown animal that she asked her husband to go back to the beach house. But I didn't tell my husband why. I was pregnant at the time, and it scared me so bad that if I had told him, he would have turned the boat around to go find it, and I didn't want him to do that. Whatever it was much larger than us and the boat. And this secret was well kept, not only from our husband, but from everybody else for 16 years. Until I told you, I had never told anyone. I knew no one would believe me anyway, she confessed, adding that she was afraid people would think she was a nut. But she says that regardless of the fears of societal ridicule, she is sure about what she saw that day. I didn't need anyone's approval. No, it was not an alligator gar. I am a country girl, know the difference. It is hard to put into words what I saw, but quite honestly, at the moment I saw this thing, I became a believer of sea monsters. What inspired me to tell my story was a TV show I was watching. It was about Nessie, the Loch Ness Monster. As I watched the show, I remembered back when I saw that thing. I don't even know what to call it. I really got to thinking about it. Google wasn't as big or as accessible back then, and I had never Googled it. I decided I would check it out to see if there was another story like mine. Then the Native American story came up. Last February, a woman from Hardin County told Cryptozoology News about the encounter with a similar creature that her grandparents had purportedly experienced while crossing the Sabine River from Louisiana into Texas. The report also included 20 additional families that were witnesses to this alleged reptilian sighting. The being was described as something that looked like a dragon. The animal had reportedly come out of the water, scaring the horses that were traveling with the families. 2 people on Thursday said that they saw a big reptilian-like bird while driving on the Interstate 80 through Nevada. Bud Davis, a 54-year-old IT executive from California, told Cryptozoology News that he and a relative were driving to Winnemucca when they came upon the unusual sight. We noticed a creature in the median of the highway, he said about the June 11th encounter. It was about 3 feet off the ground and about 20 feet from our car on the driver's side, he continued. Davis believes that the animal had just begun to take flight right before their vehicle approached at 11 p.m., as it was reportedly having problems getting off the ground. It was struggling to get enough lift to be able to fly over the car once it saw us. The creature's wings cleared the front windshield by only inches, so we both saw the thing very clearly as it flew across the front of our vehicle, left to right, and out of sight. The man describes the bird as being gray in color and had a long, thin neck. Its head, says Davis, was also thin and pointy with a long beak. He remembers it had a crest on the top of its head. The body was hump-like and appeared to be heavy. Thin, long legs. The wings were diamond-shaped and had claws at the end of each wing. A long, thin tail. From tip of beak to tip of tail, it was longer than the windshield was, so we'd estimate the overall length at 4 to 5 feet. The wingspan was wide. When in the open position, the left wing tip was positioned beyond the hood of our vehicle. The bottom half of the right wing was not visible. It was covered by the roof of the car, so we'd estimate the width, tip to tip, to be 6 to 7 feet, explained Davis. The IT executive thinks that the bird looked like a pterosaur, a flying reptile believed to have lived during the Jurassic and went extinct by the end of the Cretaceous, about 65 million years ago. Thunderbird, also known as rock, is the nomenclature used by Native Americans to refer to bird-like creatures with reptile features that are believed to be related to the extinct reptile. In Old Saybrook, Connecticut, on December 16, 1957, Mary Starr was awakened sometime between 2 and 3 in the morning by a bright light in her bedroom. When she looked out the window, she saw a gray cigar-shaped object about 20 to 30 feet long hovering above her clothesline. The object was no more than 10 feet from her house. Through the lighted porthole, Starr saw 2 figures passing each other inside, their right arms raised, walking in opposite directions. Given the height of the craft, she estimates that the figures could not be more than 3.5 to 4 feet tall. Their heads were square or rectangular and colored red-orange with a bright red bulb in the center. Starr speculated that these might be helmets. The entities wore what looked like jackets that flared out at the base. She saw no hands at the end of their raised right arms. If the entities had legs, she could not see them, as the lower portion of their bodies was not visible. As a third being appeared, the portholes began to fade and the entire object began glowing brightly. From the top of the craft, an antenna emerged that oscillated and sparkled, then retracted when the object got underway. After a few maneuvers, the object, which had small lights outlining its rim, tilted up and shot into the sky at great speed. On October 9th, 1954, at 18:30 hours, in Plounoy-le-Château, France, 4 children, Gilbert Calda, 12, Daniel Hirsch, 9, J.P. Hirsch, 5, and Robert Maguin, 16, were roller skating when they saw a luminous object near the cemetery. It was round, about 2.5 meters in diameter, standing on 3 legs. A dwarf, about 1.2 meters tall, dressed in black, having a face covered with hair and large eyes, came out and shone a blinding light at them, and then said something in an unknown language. The children ran away, but looked back in time to see the object flying away high in the sky. On October 9th, 1954, at 1900 hours, in Les Vaux, France, Mr. Barrault was riding his bicycle when he suddenly saw a figure in a diving suit aiming a double beam of light at him. The individual had boots without heels and very bright eyes, walked on the road for 1 minute, and went into the forest. The witness was paralyzed throughout the incident. The entity had a hairy chest and 2 lights, one above the other in front of him. On October 9th, 1954, at 20:30 hours, in Briatexte, France, on route N631 at La Caïfe, a technician, J.P. Mito, was coming back from Toulouse with 2 other persons when they saw 2 small figures, the height of 11-year-old children, cross the road about 5 meters in front of the car and jump into a pasture. Stopping immediately, the witnesses saw a large convex disc take off vertically. It was about 6 meters in diameter, orange in color, and was literally sucked up into the sky. Brown, oily spots were found at the site. On October 9th, 1954, at 22:15 hours, in Beirut, Lebanon, the local representative of a German firm, Max Favel, saw an object give off white light and land. It took off vertically with a spinning motion and was lost to sight. Now going to strange events in Madagascar. In Mbatolampe, poltergeist outbreak, July to August 1909. In Embo Hibeo, blood spurted from a tree being cut down, 19th June 1984. In the Straits of Madagascar, passengers on Landovery Castle saw a UFO which came down to within 45 feet of the sea, onto which it shone a searchlight. It was a huge metallic cylinder nearly 1,000 feet long, 1st of July 1947. Now going to Malaysia, in Bukit Mertajam, school children saw a tiny landed UFO and 4 3-inch tall entities, 19th May 1979. Another tiny UFO seen at Kampong Nagalithit by students who were temporarily blinded when it shone light at them, 26th of May 1979. At Lakes Chini and Barra, lake monster reports. In Ipoh, factory workers saw a 10-foot headless ghost, June 1976. In Kelantan, after terrific thunderstorm, small fish seen swimming in ankle-deep water which fell in 10 minutes onto hard-baked fields, 1915. In Kuala Lumpur, in peninsular Malaysia, poltergeist activity with objects falling out of the air, 27th February to 17th of March 1955, stones fell inside and outside house, January 1968. At Lawas River in Sarawak, water monster reports possibly a dugong, early 1985. In Lumut, at night, students saw 3 hairy creatures 10 feet tall, with red eyes. They were said to disappear into thin air, 11th August and succeeding days 1979. In Pahang State, mysterious hairy creatures 4 feet tall seen in jungles east of Kuala Lumpur, possibly members of Orang Batik, a shy primitive tribe, August 1969. Segamat, a giant which left footprints 18 inches long seen. Soldiers on guard duty who saw it at night said it was 18 feet tall, August 1966. In Sungai Siput, over 3 weeks, schoolboy pulled over 80 pieces of colored thread from his right eye. Threads always same color as shirt he was wearing, but medical profession baffled. After treatment with holy water from Hindu temple, the phenomenon stopped, May 1985. In Tessalit, Mali, Air Force officers saw a UFO, dark, yellow, and almost circular, which descended, then accelerated away fast on the 4th of October 1951. In Mauritius, a poltergeist outbreak, 21st of September to 22nd of September 1937.
What the hell in God's name is going down here?
That was a public service announcement designed to scare the shit out.
He was abducted by aliens earlier this afternoon. That little girl got lost under the bed. She went into an alternate dimension.
I'm going to read the introduction to the new edition of the book Beyond the Occult, 20 Years Research in the Paranormal by Colin Wilson. This is my most important nonfiction book. It was first published in 1988 and unites 2 main currents in my thinking: the existentialist ideas developed in The Outsider and the ideas that developed from my study of the occult. Oddly enough, I had no desire to write it. It came about because I was approached by an old friend who had been the editor of many of my early books, among them The Space Vampires and A Criminal History of Mankind. He was now working for another publisher and wanted to commission another occult book from me. I was anxious to oblige, but had no desire to write another book about the occult. Finally, I allowed myself to be persuaded. In retrospect, I have never been so satisfied with any decision I've ever made. 30 years earlier, in 1956, my first book, The Outsider, had appeared, and brought me an overnight notoriety that I found astonishing and exhausting. Since the ideas of the outsider play such an important part in Beyond the Occult, I must begin by trying to explain them. Ever since childhood, I had been baffled by a strange phenomenon. How can we want something badly, and then feel bored almost as soon as we get it? I had noticed it particularly at Christmas time. For months before Christmas Day, I would look forward to owning some long-coveted toy, yet a few hours after receiving it, I was already beginning to take it for granted, and even to find it slightly disappointing. I noticed the same thing about school holidays. How eagerly I would look forward to them during the school term, and how easily I became bored with them. I glimpsed the solution to this problem when I was still a 13-year-old schoolboy. One day, at the beginning of the 6-week-long August holiday, I went to a church bazaar and bought for a few pence some volumes of an encyclopedia called Practical Knowledge for All. It contained courses on every imaginable subject, from accountancy, aeronautics, astronomy, biology, botany, and chemistry to philosophy and zoology. I had been fascinated by astronomy and chemistry since the age of 10, and now I conceived the preposterous idea of trying to summarize all the scientific knowledge of the world in one singular notebook. I gave it the grandiose title of A Manual of General Science, and wrote steadily throughout the August holiday, filling 4 notebooks with my round schoolboy handwriting. And I noticed that I never became bored. Learning and writing about geology, biology, and philosophy, from Practical Knowledge for All, kept me happier than I had ever been in my life, and I continued writing the book over Christmas when I began the 7th volume, devoted to mathematics. All the time I was writing this book, I had an almost drunken sensation of the sheer immensity of the world of ideas, which seemed to stretch, like some marvelous unknown country, to a limitless horizon. Every day when I began writing, I felt like a traveler preparing to discover new lakes and forests and mountain ranges. I felt sorry for the other boys at school, who were ignorant of this magical kingdom where I spent my evenings and weekends. I had learned a basic lesson, that the secret of avoiding boredom is to have a strong sense of purpose. Unfortunately, when I had finished the book, the problem of boredom returned, for I had no idea of what to do next. I spent one long school holiday trying to read all the plays of Shakespeare and his major contemporaries, Marlowe, Johnson, Middleton, and the rest. During another holiday, I read works by all the major Russian writers: Askakov, Pushkin, Gogol, Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, and Chekhov. During yet another, I studied the history of art and discovered Van Gogh and Cézanne. Yet because I was merely reading and not writing about them, even this left me bored and dissatisfied. When I was 16, I came upon another important clue. It was soon after the end of the war, and a British publisher had started to reissue the novels of Dostoevsky. I bought Crime and Punishment with my pocket money. In the translator's preface, I read Dostoevsky's letter to his brother Mikhail, describing how he and other condemned revolutionaries were taken out on the Semyanovsky Square to be shot. They barked orders over our heads, and they made us put on the white shirts worn by persons condemned to execution. Being the third in the row, I concluded I had only a few minutes of life before me. I thought of you and your dear ones, and I contrived to kiss Pleshchev and Durov, who were next to me, to bid them farewell. Suddenly, the troops beat a tattoo, and we were unbound, brought back to the scaffold, and informed that His Majesty had spared our lives. One of his fellow prisoners went insane. It struck me that if Dostoevsky had been offered his pardon on condition that he promised never to be bored for the rest of his life, he would have accepted gladly and been quite certain that it should be possible, indeed, that it should be easy. And it seemed to me that he would obviously be correct. Surely someone who had been through such a crisis would only have to remember being in front of the firing squad in order to be ecstatically happy. In fact, it was this episode, and the years in Siberia that followed, that turned Dostoevsky into a great writer. Before he was arrested, he was a good but minor writer, in the tradition of Dickens and Gogol, but as a human being he was touchy and self-obsessed to the point of paranoia. His arrest, the long imprisonment in Siberia, made him aware that even to be alive is in itself a cause for rejoicing. The result of his new insight is expressed in a passage in Crime and Punishment, where the hero is afraid that he may be executed for his murder of an old woman, and thinks, if I had to stand on a narrow ledge forever and ever, in eternal darkness and tempest, I would still rather do that than die at once. He had seen that life failure, to be bored, miserable, tortured by guilt, is a form of childish spoiltness. In my mid-teens, my problem was not simply boredom with my working-class existence. My father was a boot and shoe worker who earned about £3 a week. It was a longing to escape from it and to retreat into that magical world of the mind that I had discovered when writing the Manual of General Science. This was intensified by my discovery, through Practical Knowledge for All, of the realm of English poetry. I left school when I was 16, and for a few months worked in a factory, while I prepared to take the mathematics exam a second time. Factory work made me so miserable that I spent my evenings and weekends reading poetry, all kinds of poetry, from Chaucer's Canterbury Tales to T.S. Eliot's The Waste Land. I quickly discovered that, after half an hour immersed in the world of Keats or Shelley or Wordsworth, my rage and despair turned into a gentle, sensitive melancholy, which was slowly transformed into a sense of happiness and optimism, as if I was floating above the world, looking down on it like a bird. When, in the writings of Richard Wagner, I later came across the phrase art that makes life seem like a game and withdraws us from the common fate. I understood instantly what he meant. The only problem with this state of mind, the bird's eye view, was that it was made twice as difficult to go back to work the following morning and accept the worm's eye view of boredom and triviality. Years later, when I read Thomas Mann's novel Buddenbrooks, I recognized my own problem in the episode where young Hanno Buddenbrook goes to the opera to see Wagner's Lohengrin and is transported into ecstasy, so that he feels he is walking on clouds. But when the next morning he has to get up in the freezing dawn and make his way to school through the dark, icy streets, his despair is twice as deep because he has experienced ecstasy the night before. It then seemed to me that the problem of human existence can be expressed very simply. At long intervals, we experience moments of strength and happiness in which we feel that we have the power to change the world in our own lives. But such moments are brief. For most of the time, we experience the sense of being victims of circumstance like dead leaves carried along by a river with no ability to choose our course. And when circumstances become especially difficult, it is easy to imagine that fate will afflict us with a series of misfortunes like Job that will destroy all our security and leave us completely helpless. As I read my favorite writers, Plato, Hoffman, Shelley, Nietzsche, Dostoevsky, Eliot, or listened to the music of Beethoven, or looked at the paintings of Van Gogh, it seemed to me that all shared an awareness of this problem. Plato said that the universe is divided into a world of being and a world of becoming. The world of becoming is this everyday world of matter, of endless change, in which we are trapped. The world of being is the world of intellect and ideas, the world of truth and values that lies hidden behind the facade of the material world. As he prepares to commit suicide, Socrates declares that the philosopher spends his life trying to live in the world of true being, and that therefore he should welcome death, which finally frees us from the endless distractions of the world of mere becoming. This, so I've realized, was why so many romantics were fascinated with death. Yet I still found the idea of death stupid and repellent. It was an attempt to escape from reality, and the moments of ecstasy, of bird's eye vision, seemed to promise that life itself could be lived on a level of continuous joy and affirmation. When, in my late teens, I began to write a novel, it was inevitable that it should be about this problem of the bird's eye view and the worm's eye view. The hero of Ritual in the Dark is a young man who has spent years working in boring jobs and whose strongest desire is to have the freedom to read and think and listen to music. Then he receives a small legacy which enables him to rent a cheap room and spend his days in libraries and art galleries, and he finds that this kind of freedom is curiously boring. Then he becomes accidentally involved with a man he suspects of being a murderer and feels ashamed that, now he has something to maintain his interest, he no longer feels bored. He is ashamed because it has taken an external stimuli to be suddenly renewed in his sense of being fully alive, when he feels that he ought to be able to do it himself. Surely he ought to wake up every morning with a feeling of immense gratitude for not having to go to an office. What is wrong with the human mind that it seems so incapable of freedom? It was while I was writing this novel that I decided to break off and try to express some of its basic ideas in a volume of philosophy. Inevitably, this book was about outsiders, people who felt a longing for some more purposeful form of existence and who felt trapped and suffocated in the triviality of everyday life. It was a book about moments of vision, and about the periods of boredom, frustration, and misery in which these moments are lost. It was about men like Nietzsche, Dostoevsky, Van Gogh, T.E. Lawrence, and William Blake, who have clear glimpses of a more powerful and meaningful way of living, yet who find themselves on the brink of suicide or insanity because of the frustration of their everyday lives. The problem of the outsider is summarized in the life of Vincent van Gogh. His painting, called Starry Night, is full of mystical vitality and affirmation, yet Van Gogh committed suicide and left a note that read, "Misery will never end." Here, then, is the vital question. Was the tragedy of Nietzsche and Van Gogh inevitable, or should there be some way in which human beings can live on a higher level of intensity? My own conclusion was that tragedy was not inevitable. Many outsiders caused their own downfall through self-pity. In other words, they allowed themselves to become weak. Why? Because they are inclined to feel that life is futile and meaningless, or at least that it is so difficult that it is not worth the effort. In the 20th century, this feeling has been expressed most clearly in the works of Samuel Beckett. It is recorded that when he was a young man, Beckett stayed in bed all day because he could see no reason to get up. And his works are a part of a long tradition of defeatism that goes back to Ecclesiastes, with its vanity of vanities, all is vanity, and there is nothing new under the sun. This is the feeling that haunts so many outsiders, particularly when they become tired and discouraged. It was expressed with a certain gloomy power in the philosophy of Schopenhauer. I label this sense of boredom the futility of the Ecclesiastes effect. This sense of meaninglessness was also expressed by a Greek philosopher who died 50 years before Plato was born. Heraclitus argued that the world of becoming is the only reality. Everything changes constantly. Permanence is an illusion of the senses. Therefore, man can make no real mark on the world, for any mark we make vanishes again as quickly as the tide washes away words written in the sand. This view also implies, of course, that there is no such thing as good or evil, and that values are an illusion. This is certainly the feeling we get when we are exhausted with effort, and life seems to be an endless vista of problems and complications. Yet the truth is that it is impossible to be a genuine follower of Heraclitus. According to Heraclitus, death is inevitable, and it is therefore no use making any efforts. Yet if Heraclitus had fallen into the river, he would have struggled to get out again. And if someone had put a knife through his throat and asked, "Shall I cut your windpipe and save you the trouble of living?" he would have shouted no. Still, Heraclitus has undoubtedly put his finger on our most basic problem, that everything we do is soon undone by time. Life is basically repetition. In the myth of Sisyphus, Camus writes, "Rising, streetcar, 4 hours of work, meal, sleep, and Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and Saturday, according to the same rhythm. But one day, the why arises, and everything begins in that weariness tinged with amazement." Camus calls this sudden revelation the absurd, a word he borrowed from his friend Sartre, who also coined a word for man's reaction to the absurd, nausea. Nausea is the sudden recognition that we are unnecessary, and that the world of matter that surrounds us is the only reality. Meaning is an illusion. Yet like Heraclitus, both Sartre and Camus contradicted themselves. Sartre recorded that he had never felt so free as when he was working for the French resistance, and was likely to be arrested and shot at any moment. And on the evening before his execution, the hero of Camus's novel, L'Étranger, is overwhelmed by a feeling of happiness and affirmation that sounds like Van Gogh's Starry Night. He writes, "I had been happy and I was happy still." This obviously brings us back to Dostoevsky facing the firing squad. He suddenly knows that life is not pointless and meaningless. And we all know the same thing whenever we are faced with any serious problem or crisis. We know that the statement, "life is meaningless," or "nothing is worth doing," is the self-indulgence of a philosopher who is both lazy and weak. But moments of crisis are not the only moments in which we recognize that the philosophy of Heraclitus and Samuel Beckett is nonsense. The same thing happens in all moments of sudden happiness, the feeling we experience on a spring morning or when setting out on holiday. In 7 Pillars of Wisdom, T.E. Lawrence describes such an experience. "We started on one of those clear dawns that wake up the senses with the sun, while the intellect, tired of the thinking of the night, was yet abed. For an hour or two on such a morning, the sounds, scents, and colors of the world struck man individually and directly, not filtered through or made typical by thought. They seemed to exist sufficiently by themselves, and the lack of design and carefulness in creation no longer irritated." This is the basic poetic vision, the sheer affirmation experienced by Wordsworth and Shelley and William Blake. And Lawrence has also identified the problem, the tired intellect, which questions everything. Elsewhere, he referred to it as his thought-riddled nature. It is the thought-riddled nature that causes outsiders to see life as meaningless. They are in the position of someone who wears sunglasses and complains that the world is dark. But if thought has caused this problem, surely it is capable of identifying and overcoming the problem? Let us again define this problem. It is the feeling that nothing is worth doing, that life is so complicated and the world is in such a state of endless flux that all our actions are futile. It is the feeling that we cannot do. Yet this feeling vanishes and is seen to be an illusion every time we experience the spring morning feeling described by T.E. Lawrence. Optimism gives us the certainty that action is worthwhile and that the use of the intellect can bring freedom. We only have to look around us to see the truth of this assertion. We are living in a world that has been completely transformed in the course of little more than a century by science and optimism. In fact, since the days of the caveman, human effort and optimism have steadily transformed the world. Individual men have died in failure and misery, yet the efforts of the human race have altered our lives until we are no longer mere animals, living and reproducing and dying. We are slowly learning to become something a little more like gods. This, then, is the basic philosophy I reached after The Outsider. Dr. Johnson once said, "When a man knows he is to be hanged in a fortnight, it concentrates his mind wonderfully." The pessimism of Heraclitus and Samuel Beckett is basically due to a lack of concentration. Our sense of futility, the feeling that life is just one damned thing after another, is an illusion due to fatigue. But how can we rescue ourselves from this feeling? First of all, we have to study it and understand it, as I tried to study and understand it in The Outsider. Our most important ally in this battle is the imagination. If you can imagine the feelings of Dostoevsky as he stood in front of the firing squad, then you are already learning to overcome the petty annoyances and childish weaknesses that make most people unhappy. The truth is that we have no right to be unhappy. It is an insult to the spirit of life. A man who is dying of AIDS knows that, if only he could be cured, he would live his life on a far higher level of purpose and optimism. Until the late 1960s, I had considered myself a kind of existentialist philosopher who was attempting to rescue existentialism from the pessimism of Sartre, Camus, and Heidegger. But at this point, I came upon a new subject of study that turned my thoughts in an entirely different direction. An American publisher asked me if I would be interested in writing a book about the occult. It was not a subject that interested me greatly. As a child, I had been fascinated by spiritualism and the question of whether there was life after death, but as soon as I began to study chemistry, physics, and astronomy, this interest seemed to evaporate like a dream. After the request of the publisher, I began to give the matter some new thought. I also began to ask people of my acquaintance whether they had ever had any paranormal experiences, and I was surprised by the number who said yes. One friend was a concert pianist named Mark Breton. He told me how he had been returning very late at night from a concert in central London and traveling in a taxi along the Bayswater Road. Suddenly, he knew with absolute certainty that the next traffic light, a taxi would try to jump the light and would hit them sideways. He wondered if he ought to warn his driver, but felt that he might be regarded as slightly mad, and at the next traffic light, a taxi tried to beat the light at Queensway and hit them sideways. It seemed to me that there was a certain parallel between Mark's experience and that of T.E. Lawrence in the early dawn. Both had been tired, and the intellect was therefore asleep. But what peculiar power could make Mark aware of something that would happen in the future? I had already recognized that the mind possesses the power to escape from pessimism and defeat by meditating on a firing squad, but this was something altogether more strange and unusual. Another friend, the historian A.L. Rouse, told me how he had been leaning out of a window in Oxford. The window frame was very heavy, and it occurred to him that if it fell, it might easily kill him. Since he was in a bad mood, he thought, let the damn thing fall. A few moments later, just after he had withdrawn his head, the window fell. Rouse also told me how, one quiet afternoon, he had a sudden premonition that if he went into the college library, he would find two young men embracing. He crossed two quadrangles and walked into the library and saw the two young men embracing. Even stranger was an experience described to me by a middle-aged friend named Kay Lunis, who spent several days a week in our house, helping to look after our children. Kay described how she had once been seriously ill and had felt herself rise up above her body so she could look down on it, and she had descended and re-entered her body. A few years earlier, I would have at least considered the possibility that this was some kind of hallucination due to fever, but in gathering material for the occult, I had come across far too many cases of out-of-the-body experiences to doubt that it was possible. Another friend, Lyle Watson, had described how, when his vehicle overturned in Kenya, he suddenly found himself hovering above the bus and looking at the head and shoulders of a boy who had been hurled halfway through the canvas roof. It occurred to him that if the bus rolled any further, the boy would be crushed. A few minutes later, he recovered consciousness in the driving seat, got out of the vehicle, and rescued the boy, who was in exactly the position he had seen a few moments earlier. Now, if these friends were telling the truth, and I was strongly inclined to believe that they were, then human beings possess at least two powers that were unsuspected by Heraclitus, Schopenhauer, and Samuel Beckett: the power to see the future and the power to leave the body. Now, quite clearly, if this were true, then it should be taken into account in any attempt to create a philosophy of human existence. Such a philosophy demands that we try to understand what man is, and if, in certain moments, man can see into the future, then he is certainly more than Heraclitus assumed. Inevitably, I also had to reconsider the question of life after death. Another friend, Professor G. Wilson Knight, was a convinced spiritualist, and told me a circumstantial story that seemed to prove beyond all doubt that his mother had survived death. Now, Dostoevsky had once remarked that if there is such a thing as life after death, it would be the most important thing that human beings could possibly know. And Dostoevsky was the most profound of the existential philosophers. In the Brothers Karamazov, Ivan Karamazov argues that the world is so full of suffering that no religion can justify it. Ivan says that he wants to give God back his entrance ticket. Here he is expressing the philosophy of Heraclitus in Ecclesiastes and Sartre, that in a world dominated by brute matter, man is a useless passion who is doomed to defeat. Yet Dostoevsky recognized that if there is life after death, this fact would change everything. This, then, is why I regard the evidence of the paranormal as so important. According to Western philosophy, which begins with Descartes, it is the philosopher's duty to doubt everything until he has achieved some area of ultimate certainty, no matter how small, on which he can take his stand. Unfortunately, this method has failed to yield any kind of certainty. It led Bishop Berkeley to doubt the existence of the material world and David Hume to doubt cause and effect, and even the existence of the self. It led Sartre to conclude that it is meaningless that we live and meaningless that we die, and Camus to regard human life as absurd. The most fashionable of modern French philosophers, Jacques Derrida, is quite simply a descendant of Heraclitus, who believes that there is no such thing as underlying meaning, which he calls presence, in the universe. The only reality is the endless flux of matter. When The Occult appeared in 1971, it soon became apparent that many people who had regarded me as a kind of maverick existentialist now believed that I had turned to more trivial topics and abandoned the rigor of my outsider books. To me, such a view was incomprehensible. It seemed obvious to me that if the paranormal was a reality, as I was increasingly convinced that it was, then any philosopher who refused to take it into account was merely closing his eyes. To begin with, most modern philosophers seem united in denying that man has a central self or soul. The Scottish philosopher David Hume started this revolution in the 18th century when he declared that when I enter most intimately into what I call myself, I always stumble on some particular perception or other. I never catch myself at any time. Sartre declared that man has no self. What he thinks of as himself is really created by the outside world, the gaze of others. And this is the position that has been accepted by French philosophers ever since. Derrida, who is celebrated for his theory of deconstruction, believes that the self is a delusion that has been created by metaphysical philosophers whom he rejects with contempt. Sartre's close ally, Simone de Beauvoir, expressed the same notion when she wrote, in Paris in Cineas, I look at myself in vain in a mirror, tell myself my own story. I can never grasp myself as an entire object. I experience in myself the emptiness that is myself. I feel that I am not. In other words, man is a purely superficial creature. The sense of selfhood is like a mere reflection on the surface of a pond. Sartre carried this view to its logical conclusion when he declared that there is no such thing as the unconscious mind. Yet, as soon as we begin to study the paranormal, we immediately encounter the existence of all kinds of powers that contradict Sartre in Simone de Beauvoir. Far from being a mere reflection on the surface of a pond, man seems to be like an iceberg whose most important part is hidden below the surface. Of course, Freud and Jung had already told us about the unconscious, the word was actually invented by Leibniz, but it would seem that even they underestimated its powers. Even the anecdotes I have recounted above seem to indicate that the part of the self hidden below the waterline possesses virtually magical powers. Of course, as Dostoevsky recognized, the ultimate contradiction of the view that we possess no self would be an actual proof of life after death, for without a self, there would be nothing to survive death. This ultimate proof eludes us, but the existence of other paranormal powers seems to leave no doubt of the truth of the iceberg view of the human mind. Moreover, it seems clear that some of these powers that lie below the surface seem to contradict the scientific view of man. Science tells us that the future has not happened, therefore we can only guess what is going to happen. Yet when he was deeply relaxed, Mark Breeden had a clear premonition of what would happen when his taxi reached the next traffic light. Robert Graves, the friend to whom the occult was dedicated, drew my attention to another curious example of these unknown powers. It is described in one of his autobiographical stories called The Abominable Mr. Gunn. In Graves' class at prep school, there was a boy called F.F. Smiley, who was apparently a mathematical prodigy, a lightning calculator. When the master, Mr. Gunn, had given the boys a difficult mathematical problem, Smiley simply wrote down the answer. He explained that he had not had to work it out because it had just come to him. Mr. Gunn accused him of looking up the answer in the back of the book. Smiley denied this and pointed out that the answer in the back of the book had 2 figures wrong. Mr. Gunn regarded this as impertinence and sent Smiley to the headmaster to be caned. After that, he bullied Smiley into doing problems the normal way. In the same story, Graves records a curious anecdote about himself. One summer evening, as he was sitting behind the cricket pavilion and presumably in a deeply relaxed state of mind like T.E. Lawrence and Mark Breeden, he received a sudden celestial illumination. It occurred to me that I knew everything. I remember letting my mind range rapidly over all the familiar subjects of knowledge, only to find that this was no foolish fancy. I did know everything. To be plain, though conscious of having come less than a third of the way along the path of formal education, nevertheless held the key to truth in my hand and could use it to open any lock of any door. Mine was no religious or philosophical theory, but a simple method of looking sideways at disorderly facts so as to make perfect sense of them. This, of course, is precisely what existentialism wants to do, and precisely what I am trying to do in this introduction, to look sideways at the disorderly facts of human existence and try to find some way of making sense of them. Graves apparently did it when he was 15. He says that he tried out his insight on various obstinate locks and found that they all opened smoothly. The insight was still intact when he woke up the next day, but when he tried to record it in the back of an exercise book, my mind went too fast for my pen. He had another try later, but the insight had vanished. Nevertheless, together with Smiley's curious abilities, it convinced Graves that we possess a peculiar power which is not generally recognized by science, a supralogic that cuts out all routine processes of thought and leaps straight from problem to answer. It is worth looking a little more closely into this mystery. There are certain numbers called primes, which cannot be divided by any other number without leaving a remainder, numbers like 3, 5, 7, and 11. 9 is not a prime because it can be divided exactly. The actual number of primes is infinite, but if a number is very large, there is no way of telling whether it is a prime or not, except by the long and painful process of dividing every smaller number into it. Yet a Canadian calculating prodigy named Zerah Colburn was asked whether a certain 10-digit number was a prime and replied after a moment, no, it can be divided by 641. There is no logical way of doing this. The psychiatrist Oliver Sacks has described a pair of subnormal twins in a New York mental hospital who amused themselves by swapping 24-figure primes. Obviously, the twins somehow rise into the air like birds over the whole number field and instantly see which number is a prime and which is not. I would suggest that the ability that enabled Mark Breeden to know that his taxi would be struck by another taxi is closely related to the ability of Zerah Colburn and the Sacks twins, and that both are related to T.E. Lawrence's feeling on the morning when the senses awoke before the intellect. Now, long before I became interested in the occult, I had been fascinated by another example of the powers that lie below the iceberg. I say below the iceberg rather than below the visible part of the iceberg because it has always seemed to me that man's hidden powers are located in the sea below the iceberg as much as in the iceberg itself. As everyone knows, Proust's vast novel, À la recherche du temps perdu, sprang from a single incident in his childhood, just as Graves' theories in The White Goddess sprang from his experience behind the cricket pavilion. One day, feeling tired and depressed, Proust's hero is offered by his mother a small cake, called a madeleine, dipped in herb tea. As he tastes it, he experiences an exquisite sensation of sheer happiness. I had now ceased to feel mediocre, accidental, mortal. After eating another bite, he recalls what has caused this feeling of power and happiness. The madeleine has revived memories of his childhood in a small country town called Cambrai, where his Aunt Leonie used to give him a taste of her own madeleine dipped in the same herb tea. Why should this make him feel so happy? Because it has reminded him of the depths below the iceberg. He had been feeling bored and depressed, in other words superficial, Now he catches a glimpse of the depths of his own mind and of its hidden powers. He also realizes that if only he could learn the trick of bringing back this feeling, he would never be unhappy again. This is why he sets out to revive it by writing his enormous autobiographical novel. Yet this deliberate intellectual activity fails. When he catches other glimpses of this magical feeling of power and strength, it is always by accident when he is thinking of something else. In the 10th volume of his A Study of History, Arnold Toynbee describes several occasions on which he also had these strange glimpses into the reality of the past. Not his own past, but that of history. On each of these occasions, he actually seemed to see the past as if he had been transported by a time machine. On one of these occasions, he seemed to see the Battle of Pharsalus, which had taken place in 197 BC, and saw some horsemen, of whose identity he was ignorant, galloping away from the massacre. It seems clear from his descriptions that he felt this was not imagination, but some kind of glimpse of the past, like Mark Braden's glimpse of the future. And beyond the occult, I cite many other examples of more distinct glimpses of the future which proved to be accurate. On a snowy day in Washington in 1966, thinking about this curious ability to make real other times and other places, I labeled it Faculty X. But Faculty X should not be regarded as some paranormal faculty. It is simply the opposite of that feeling of being mediocre, accidental, mortal, which all of us feel when we are tired and depressed, and which Sartre calls contingency. And whenever Faculty X awakens, it tells us that we are not contingent, not mediocre, accidental, mortal. Our powers are far greater than we realize. In the occult, I had pointed out that animals seem to possess all kinds of paranormal powers. The wife of the Scottish poet Hugh MacDiarmid told me that her dog knows when her husband will return from a long journey and goes and sits at the end of their lane several days before he arrives. On one occasion, the dog knew he was going to return before he did, circumstances that caused him to make a sudden decision to return home. In his book Man-Eaters of Kumaon, the tiger hunter Jim Corbett describes how he came to develop a faculty which he called jungle sensitiveness, which told him when he was in danger. I argue that all our remote ancestors possessed such a faculty, and that we have gradually lost it because we do not need it. Yet many people have not lost it. The archaeologist Clarence Wyant describes how the Montagnais Indians of eastern Canada are able to contact distant friends and relatives by telepathy. When they wish to make contact, the Indians go into a remote hut in the forest and build up the necessary psychic energy, mana, through meditation. Then the relative would hear his voice. Distance makes no difference. Now it is obvious that it is simpler to pick up the telephone when we want to contact a distant relative. Yet this does not mean that picking up a telephone is just as good as contacting him through clairaudience. The Indian who is able to call upon these faculties from the depths of his own mind has an understanding of nature, a sense of connection with the rest of the universe, and a deeper knowledge of himself that the rest of us have lost. What has happened is clear. Even towards the end of the 19th century, the English poet Matthew Arnold was mourning that Victorian man no longer had access to Wordsworth's healing power, while Tennyson was complaining that science had destroyed faith and left man in an empty universe trapped in his own smallness. But the problem had started long before the 19th century. Perhaps when Euclid systematized geometry and Archimedes rolled away down an inclined plane. This kind of knowledge, which Graves calls solar knowledge, gradually eclipsed man's lunar knowledge, man's intuitive awareness of the hidden part of the iceberg. This was the problem that I had discussed in the second volume of The Outsider, called in England Religion and the Rebel. Now, and beyond the occult, I attempted to bring together this philosophy of outsiderism and the insights I had gained from the study of the occult. Yet I began to write the book reluctantly, feeling that I was merely regurgitating something I had already expressed in previous books. But I soon realized that I was creating a new synthesis. The problem of human beings is that it is possible to know something without really knowing it. The adult Proust thought he knew he was a child in Cambrai, but the Madeleine taught him that his adult knowledge was superficial. I thought I knew the ideas I had expressed in books like The Outsider and The Occult. Writing about them again made me realize that my knowledge of them was superficial. In order to really know something, we must meditate upon it until we have absorbed it into our being. I have to confess that even writing this introduction has once again made me aware of this truth. Beyond the Occult is an attempt to draw together all the insights I have discussed here and many more, particularly the insights of those who have had sudden mystical experiences. They all teach us the same thing, that our ordinary consciousness of ourselves is superficial and deceptive. We are all like Simone de Beauvoir, looking in the mirror and feeling that we can never grasp ourselves as an entire object. Here's a typical example of one of those experiences. A girl describes how, when she was 16, she set out to walk up a lane towards a wood. I was not feeling particularly happy or particularly sad, just ordinary. As she stood in a cornfield, looking towards the wood, everything suddenly changed. Everything surrounding me was this white, bright, sparkling light, like sun on frosty snow, like a million diamonds, and there was no cornfield, no trees, no sky. This light was everywhere. The feeling is indescribable, but I have never experienced anything in the years that followed that I can compare with that glorious moment. It was blissful, uplifting. I felt open-mouthed wonder. Then the tops of the trees became visible once again, then a piece of sky, and gradually the light was no more, and the cornfield was spread before me. I stood there for a long time, trying in vain for it to come back, and have tried many times. I only saw it once, but I know in my heart it is still there, and here, around us. The girl who describes this in a book called Seeing the Invisible which consists of letters about mysticism written to Alistair Hardy Foundation, obviously had an experience which, in some ways, resembled that of Proust. Something triggered this marvelous perception of sparkling light. And she remains convinced that it is still there, that our everyday consciousness somehow filters it out, just as if we were wearing a pair of dark glasses. It is, of course, deeply frustrating that we cannot learn how to contact these depths below the iceberg at will. Yet, as I have tried to show, it is not as difficult as it sounds. The conclusions I have reached over the years are as follows. The Romantics of the 19th century had many of these glimpses because they knew how to relax. The girl in the anecdote above does not say so, but it is clear that she was deeply relaxed. But because the Romantics were inclined to weakness, like Samuel Beckett, most of them could see no reason for getting out of bed. They failed to grasp the most important clue, that such experiences bring a feeling of strength, and that the best way to achieve them is certainly not to indulge in weakness and self-pity. Abraham Maslow, who called such moments peak experiences, discovered that his peakers were usually strong and healthy people who coped well with their lives. In Beyond the Occult, I describe an interesting example of how I succeed in achieving higher consciousness for most of an afternoon in 1979. It was the new year, and I had gone to a remote farmhouse in Devon to give a lecture to a group of extramural students. During that evening it began to snow, and by the following morning the snow was so thick that it would have been impossible to drive back home. I was forced to stay there another night. The following morning the weather forecast announced more snow, and it was obvious that I might be unable to leave for a week. I determined to try to escape, and a group of us began to clear the snow in the farmyard with shovels. When the farmyard was clear, each of us tried to drive our cars up the slope that led to the gate. Mine was the only car whose tires would grip the slippery surface. There was still half a mile of snow-covered farm track between the farmyard and the main road. I would drive a few yards, then get out and help to shovel snow. At one point, I even risked driving straight across the field to avoid a long bend in the road. And finally, after several hours of hard work, I walked back to the farmhouse to eat some lunch and collect my bags. Then I walked back to the main gate and began the long drive back home. Yet even now it was impossible to relax my vigilance, because the narrow country roads were covered in snow, and it was impossible to see the ditch on either side. It would have been easy to drive off the road and become stranded again, perhaps all night. So I sat forward in my seat, peering out of the windscreen, and focusing all my concentration. Several hours later, I arrived at the main road, where heavy traffic had turned the snow into muddy slush, and it was possible to relax and drive normally again. And it was now that I realized that I was full of a sense of power and concentration. Everything I looked at was obviously fascinating, and I had a sense of meanings stretching around me into the distance. Everything I saw reminded me of something else, for example, of Christmases in my childhood. It was as if my normally narrow and limited consciousness had been widened and deepened by the concentration, until the whole world was seen to be fascinating. It taught me that higher consciousness, positive consciousness, can be achieved by an active focused concentration. And Beyond the Occult, I also quote the experiences of a writer called R.H. Ward, whose book about psychedelic drugs, A Drug Taker's Notes, is a modern classic. Early in the book, Ward describes how he once had a remarkable experience under dental gas. He writes, "I passed, after the first few inhalations of the gas, directly into a state of consciousness far more complete than the fullest degree of ordinary consciousness. He had a sense of enormously extended vision, so that his mind was aware of all kinds of things that would normally have been beyond his natural range of awareness. Like Robert Graves behind the cricket pavilion, he seemed to understand everything. And as he continued rising, he seemed to pass through a region of ideas. All was idea, and form did not exist." And he adds, "It seems to me very interesting that one should, thus, in a dentist chair in the 20th century, receive practical confirmation of the theories of Plato." In short, Ward had seen the truth of Plato's notion that the universe consists of two worlds, a world of becoming and a world of true being. He had also seen the falseness of Heraclitus' belief that the only world is the world of becoming. If we think once more of Dostoevsky in front of the firing squad, we can see that the expectation of death galvanized him to a new level of attention in which he concentrated the mind as never before, and as I concentrated my mind as I drove through the snow. It is this act of concentration, like pulling back a spring-loaded piston or the string of a crossbow, that gives the mind the ability to become aware of the immense depths that lie below the iceberg.
Science can explain everything if we look hard enough.
Shut up, science bitch.
Nothing is true. Everything is real. Not only is he like ruining my life, but with all this God shit that he's into, he could be ruining my afterlife.
It's a sort of interdimensional vagina that somehow appears. I can interact with it.
Fabric of the entire universe could be torn apart.
I know my mind is changing. I'm already too far